going on in practice, rather than waiting for knowledge to be developed, which we can then apply, we think that that's not suitable for this world that we live in. So we're going to talk about communities of practice, but underneath it all is really our exploration of social learning.
And really, the reason we work on learning theory is because we think that actually your learning theory matters, because your learning theory, whether it is an articulated conscious learning theory or whether it is just, you know, a subconscious learning theory, really changes the way that you go about supporting and enabling and recognizing and evaluating learning. And so for us, you know, there's a very prevalent view of learning in the world, which is the cognitive view of learning, we call it. And it's learning as a transmission of certainty. So the idea of the picture on the left is that you have a professor there who is imparting their certainty to an audience of people who are drinking it in. So here, learning happens when somebody is sure about something, knows something for sure, and then imparts this knowledge to an audience who drinks it.
Whereas in a social view of learning, we would say that learning is when everybody is at the edge of what they don't know. They're engaging their uncertainty about how to do something, which is what happens more in practice. When you actually work in practice, the world is full of like, do I quite do this? It's little micro decisions about what you should or shouldn't do. So here, for example, in this picture, it's a group of people brought together by the World Bank who are generally used to having an expert from the World Bank come and tell them how to, they are people who work in the finance ministry on budget or treasury. They have to produce some guidelines, but you know, the people who know how to produce the guidelines are the people who have to produce the guidelines, and they talk to each other about what they're doing and what they actually need in order for it to be politically, practically, culturally, applicable in their context. And so here the expert is there really just in order to convene the space while people work out what would be the most effective thing for them in their context, and with a view to what actually happens in practice. So not what happens, not what ought to happen, not the right thing to do, but by dealing with what actually happens in practice.
And what's important there is that the person from the World Bank is not holding back what they know to let the students kind of working it out for themselves. Everybody is on the edge of what they know how to do. So I think that's
yeah. So the expert is in there aware that he doesn't know the appropriate cultural or practical thing for them in their circumstance. But what he can do is give a wider perspective and his opinion, but it doesn't hold any more water than that of those people actually doing the job.
And so I think it's worth quickly giving you a sense of how this learning theory has evolved, because it has gone through different phases, and often people don't realize how much a learning theory, or any theory for that matter, is a work in progress. And so we'll briefly take you through the evolution of it, which it started in the 80s at a research institute called the Institute for Research on Learning in California, where the remit was, let's rethink learning from the ground up and independently of teaching or schooling institutions, so that with a new view of learning, we can maybe reimagine the institutions that are going to help people learn. So that was the idea of this institute, bringing together people from different disciplines who fought for the right to define learning. But it was sort of interesting. And the term community of practice came out of work that I was doing with an anthropologist, Jane Leib, about apprenticeship. So the first thing we looked at was, hey, apprenticeship has been with human beings for a long time, long before schools. Let's take a look. And we looked at different examples of apprenticeship around the world. And in particular, she had been studying tailors in Africa. And so one important observation where we were looking at the different cases of apprenticeship in different contexts was that the learning is not taking place so much with the master. If you're a young apprentice and you don't know how to do something, you don't go to the master, you go to another apprentice who is a bit ahead of you, and you say, hey, how do I do this? You know? And so we needed a name for this kind of living curriculum that existed there for the apprentice, and we called it a community of practice. So this is how the term was born.
And a kind of key feature of that first phase was actually there was a master and there were apprentices. So it still had the assumption that there was an existing practice and there was a master of that practice, and then other people would work from the periphery to the middle and become better and more closely like the master. Whereas in what we call phase two, in phase two, this was much more an issue of, as we were saying before, of there is no necessary master. So for example, similar to the group in the first one, this is a group again brought together by the World Bank, internal auditors in the public sector in Eastern Europe and Russia. Internal auditing was a new thing that countries in Eastern Europe needed in order to be able to join the European Union, but they didn't know how to do it because under the Soviet system, there wasn't internal auditing. And, you know, in the beginning, they tried to bring experts in from OECD and other world experts in to help them to set up internal auditing practices. But actually, nobody knew what it was like to do it under the old Soviet system. It had its own particular challenges and opportunities. And so here, these are internal auditors across that region discussing what should our internal auditing system look like? What resources do we need? What support do we need? And it's a very long-lasting community of practice, this one, about 15 years it's been going. But here you can see, nobody knows, there is no master in internal auditing in the public sector in Eastern Europe and ex-Soviet countries. Nobody knows how to do it. So they are working out the practice on the go. So it's very much learning on the go with no master, but still developing, in a sense, a sort of social curriculum. What does it mean to be a good internal auditor in our context?
And what was happening there is that all these people were learning together because they shared a practice. It was a similar practice that allowed them to act as learning partner. And they recognized each other's challenges because they were the same or similar challenges in a different context. But more recently, we've often been asked to go and facilitate learning moments, which did not involve people from the same practice. And the example that you have in that third picture up there is an example of a group of people who deal with infectious disease surveillance. So how do we quickly recognize that a new disease is emerging and react to it properly? It was after the Ebola crisis, and one foundation in the US felt that people were working at cross purposes, overlapping gaps existing in the approach. So they brought together different players in the field. And you had like foundations who funded project, but you also had the WHO was there. You also had Facebook, because Facebook said, hey, by looking at the queries that come into Facebook, we can recognize if something is happening quickly. So you had very different practices. And the purpose of that moment was not to bring people together into one community of practice, but to allow people to learn at the boundary between their practices. And so that was for us important to see the learning capability here does not reside in a single practice. The learning capability that we need to make the field move forward exists in the intersection, in the interlocking of different practices, all working towards the same goal. And so we talked about the landscape of practice, the field of infectious disease surveillance is actually a landscape of different practices in different positions with respect to each other. And what you see them doing on the wall is to sort of like create a sort of general view. This big matrix is creating a general view of the field, who is doing what. In green, it's what people are doing well. In blue, what they would like to do better. In red, what they are not doing. And so they are creating a kind of visual of the field. And then that was the first day. The next day, they would create little working groups to start addressing the challenges that came out in that matrix. But they were not going to become a single committee of practice. You know, the foundations were not going to become a WHO. Facebook was not going to become a medical establishment. So the purpose was not to make everybody the same and better, but to create a productive interlocking of their different practices.
And here is a slide where you can see, I mean, the many, many, many organizations that have used this idea of communities of practice and social learning. They use it in very many different ways. Each one is a case of its own, but it's worth, we've got companies at the top, we've got government organizations at the bottom, we've got university institutes on the right, and non-governmental organizations over on the left, but a real wide range.
And it's worth telling a few stories about what these organizations have been doing. Like, for instance, in the middle, you have like JP Morgan Chase, which is a large bank. And in their technology section, they have more technologists than Microsoft to make sure that your credit card is safe and your account are not being hacked and all that stuff. So these people, they are like techies, you know, and so they have an initiative called Ignite, which is basically an invitation to anybody who would like to create a community of practice with other people around a topic of interest to start that. So they have a voting system. You propose a topic. There are people who vote. Yeah, this is an important topic. If you have enough votes, boom, the initiative is going to support you. Well, they have another condition that you have two people who are willing to take leadership. So they have put a few conditions, enough vote to show that the topic is not just yours, but broader. And the condition that two people are willing to lead the charge. And for them, what's important there, the benefit that they see, apart from the fact that these techies become better at their techiness, you know, but it's also giving them a sense of agency, giving them a sense that what they think matters. They are not just there to serve an organization through compliance and just doing things on projects that they're asked to do. They are actors in their practice, and they can propose. They have like 170 communities now, many on similar topics in different parts of the world. But you know what really matters is that the practitioners feel that what they think is important to move forward with is recognized by the organization. They are supported to do that. They have fairs where the communities show what they're doing. The chief technology officer is completely there, comes to these fairs to see what people are doing and to support it. So for them, it's really an important move from a very kind of top-down organization to a sense by these techies that they can lead the charge on strategic capabilities that need to be developed for the organization. And actually they use that as a recruiting device because they are competing for these techies with Google and Microsoft and Amazon and all these technology companies. So for them, recruiting is very difficult, and they are using the fact that they have communities as a recruiting device and a retaining device for employees who could very easily find a job somewhere else. So that's an example of a use of community of practice inside a business organization.
And then a sort of contrasting case is the one underneath, frontline negotiations, the Center of Competence and Humanitarian Negotiation. Now, here what you have is that across the world, as we speak, there are many people who are working in places either as project managers or agricultural extension workers or tribal leaders, but who find themselves involved in negotiations, in humanitarian negotiations. It may be food being delivered to somewhere, for example, in Afghanistan, and they have to negotiate that that food gets to the people who need it, and that there may, for example, that it doesn't get pocketed off by the army or by politicians. They may or may not be called a humanitarian negotiator. They may be called a project manager, but a lot of their life is spent in negotiating things in very hard conditions. And those ones who, they are very rarely recognized as negotiators, especially by organizations, those who work for organizations, for example, like the International Red Cross. So when somebody gets kidnapped, when a group of people get kidnapped in Somalia, they say, we don't negotiate. So a lot of these international organizations say, we don't negotiate. But of course, you have to negotiate. If you didn't negotiate, nothing would happen. So they really do have to work very often under the radar and very, very separately. So there was one section within the International Red Cross who separated themselves and started a community of practice for humanitarian negotiators, so that somebody out in the desert in Afghanistan negotiating for people or for food could talk to somebody else who is in Nigeria negotiating with in a village for the safety of children, to others who are negotiating for Somali pirates, because
and including in Ukraine, actually, to negotiate
that's right, to
corridors,
make
safe corridors for people.
Yeah. And so by bringing them together to talk about it, although it looks like very different contexts, they found that they had faced very similar problems and they had very similar needs, and they required very similar support. These people who are doing these negotiations actually end up mostly suffering from some form of PTSD, and they need to lean on each other in order to help each other and give each other care and support, because they don't get it. They're often negotiating between two sides, so they definitely don't get it from sides. They're often, if they make a slighter slip, or even if they don't make a slip, they spend a lot of time thinking, oh God, what if I had done that? What if I had said that? That person wouldn't have died. More people would have got food. So it's a very traumatic sort of role that they find each other in. Anyway, it has become a massive community of practice, actually. It has thousands of people now. And in this community of practice, the Center of Competence of Humanitarian Negotiation, what they do is bring people together and find out what kind of problems and issues they're negotiating with each other. Then they develop some very basic tools as to what to use. And they agree on some very basic principles that they will use out in the field. So that people, when they go back, feel like, back on the front line, they really feel like they have, what they're doing is within some sort of principled framework that all international negotiators are using. And
but
so
I think it's important to say, Bev, is that, you know, in medicine, for instance, people also do that. They have frameworks, but these are mostly done by researchers who are not practitioners. So here, what the Center for Competence in Humanitarian Negotiation is bringing the practitioners themselves and making them kind of co-researchers or researchers of their own practice. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's it really. But all credit. I mean, one thing is to remember a lot of these people who, you know, can't travel. They're out in villages. With COVID, when everybody started going online, actually this community grew like anything because everything was then done online. And those people in far off villages could participate, however hard. Many of them come in on a landline or a phone out in the middle of nowhere. But I think one of the things that often strikes me with this community is that despite the incredible difficulties in connecting, this need to get support and to grow your practice with other like-minded people is so strong that people will go to great lengths in order to do it. So Jennifer asks the difference between a community of practice and a support group.
Well, actually, this humanitarian community, they say we do three things. We do guidance, support, and what was the third one, Bev? I don't remember. But yeah, but one of the value of their community is to act as a support group. But they're not just a support group. You see, they don't just cry on each other's shoulders. They also develop the practice. So in this case, they act as a support group. I would say at JP Morgan Chase, they don't really act as support groups. They're much more focused on the practice dimension. But the thing about a committee of practice is that you have to enable people to do the work, not just give them instructions. And to enable people to do the work, it means that you have to deal with PTSD, you know, because otherwise you cannot do the work. So it's not just like how to become a good negotiator as an act, it's how to be a good negotiator as an experience of life. So in some sense, it is true that many times committees of practice end up being kind of support group, because helping a person develop the strength to do what needs to be done can be viewed as support group. But for us, it is recognizing that practice needs practitioners and practitioners need to be able to do the practice. And the two things go together. You know, you cannot develop one without the other, you know? So that's why a committee of practice is such a rich and important learning context, because it recognizes that knowledge has to be lived. And if there is no way for a knower to live the knowledge, then this knowledge is useless. So
and they're even JP Morgan Chase, Etienne, act, whether they call it or not, as a support group, in the sense that, like, there are stories of people who come in as fairly new to the organization, young, who are trained in one particular thing, but who are interested in developing some other part of themselves. And they use the communities of practice to develop themselves and to rise up in their career. And with the support of other members of their community, you say, go for it, Jane. You know, you're really good at that. You know, go and do this, go and do that. You know, don't get put down. So
that's very true. Yeah. Yeah, that's very true. Yeah.
Etienne,
So, yep.
keep going because we've got 7 minutes.
Yeah. So when you ask people, why in the world would you participate, waste your time with a community of practice? This is the kind of thing that you hear them say. Like, you know, we want help. I need help. Sometimes I'm facing something very, very hard and I need help. And sometimes you hear, I need to know what other people are doing that will inspire me. I need to hear stories of people who are doing something in a different context. Or I want to reflect on my practice and improve it with other people who can understand what I'm struggling with. So there are all sorts of reasons, like cooperating on innovation. That's very much what that group on infectious disease surveillance was doing. We need to put our brains together so we can innovate productively in the field. Sometimes to find a voice and gain strategic influence. That's very much actually what the negotiators community was trying to do. It's first trying to put this practice on the map, to say, hey, this is an important practice that organization needs to recognize and support if they want to become more effective. So it has now, as a community, gained a strategic influence within these humanitarian organizations. So very many different ways that people reflect on the value that they get from participating.
So when people ask, what do communities of practice do? You know, if they're not in an amphitheater listening to an expert with and here is a slide. I don't think we need to go into it in a lot of detail, Etienne, but just to show that there are a number of different things. Case clinics where people bring a problem to the table that they're facing in their practice, and it's a slightly structured way to help their colleagues to help them think through their challenge and give advice.
The bottom one in the middle is actually the same activity but done online, where one member brings a problem, but that's done online with video. In the middle, on the right, you have a debate. So this is a community of practice that had a choice to make between, well, it was in Kyrgyzstan, between finance budgeting being done centrally or locally, and so they divide the community into two sides. Debate. It's a very exciting activity. So just to show you that there is a variety of different kind of activities that you can organize to help a community engage in this kind of peer learning activities.
And it's not a sort of teacher's activity. You know, people do debates in school or to give people practice of debates, or in the top center one is a role play. People do role plays, but very often when it's designed by an instructional designer or a teacher, it's in order to help people get closer to finding out the answer, right? Here, it is a genuine problem of practice, and the activity is going to help people have a rich and fruitful discussion about their practice. It's not to get them closer to any one answer.
And if we ask ourselves, what are the deep characteristic under these practices, these activities, is that they really open what we call a social learning space. And in a social learning space, there are important characteristics of the learning, and they are there on the right of the slide. So we are there because we care to make a difference. And can I tell you, one inspiring part of this work for us is we meet so many people who really genuinely care to make a difference. And this is why they are there to learn. And it gives an intensity, a kind of urgency to the learning, because they really care to make a difference. And for us, that's one of the key characteristics of a community of practice or a social learning space. So there is this intensity, but what drives the learning is not somebody teaching like we were in our first slide, sharing their certainty. What drives the learning is people engaging their uncertainty in the space. And that drives the learning. And so the uncertainty becomes fodder for conversations, debates, exchange, proposing solutions, and so on and so forth. And the third dimension of a social learning space that has to be there is that people come and they're going to pay attention to what is happening. They don't come, with a grain of salt in their mouth, or they don't come just full of their own knowledge. They are open to being surprised by where the learning is going. So they really pay attention to what the learning is moving towards. And so sometimes paying attention means unlearning things that you thought you knew, So we find that when those three vectors are together in a group, something happens, a kind of learning magic happens, and we call that a social learning space.
Then interestingly, Amy asks if there's a need for a facilitator or a coordinator on an ongoing basis to maintain the community of practice. Well, there's kind of like, the answer always is, it depends. Communities of practice have actually been around forever. Just the fact that Etienne gave a name to it didn't mean they only started existing then. So when people left their cave to go and hunt down a deer, they watched each other. They looked to see, they would say, oh no, I tried that and it didn't work. I don't know what they said in the equivalent of that, but they learned from and with each other about how to track down and kill enough deer to eat in their cave by watching each other, not by going out as a single individual and doing it.
And perhaps, just perhaps, this was one of the key advantages of humankind over other species, is that they formed these social learning spaces and these communities of practice to improve collectively.
And then right up to the other extreme is if we want to be intentional about it, and as we learn about it, there's certain things we can see. So for example, if you think some people have difficulty in expressing that they care to make a difference, maybe they're not used to it, right? They're not used to having their voice heard, or that, they've learned that there's no point in saying what difference you care to make. Okay. Maybe some people find it hard to engage uncertainty. If you think that you, very often women, for example, engage uncertainty, and lots of men will jump in the space and tell you what the answer is. So engaging uncertainty can be a tricky thing. Maybe you need a facilitator in those moments to allow people to engage their uncertainty. We have a concept which is that of intruder. Very often when you engage uncertainty, somebody will jump in the space thinking they're making a contribution to the space because they want to tell everybody what the answer is. And they never let you fall into that space of like engaging your uncertainty. They jump in with the answer, often with the best intentions. You may need a facilitator who then arranges activities and things so that the intruder has less of a space for stopping this engagement of uncertainty. Paying attention. If you're an important person, you often don't need to pay attention. Maybe you need a facilitator who can help. So a facilitator or a coordinator can be very helpful in making sure that these conditions are maximized, really. And also a coordinator or a facilitator may be jolly useful for things like booking the room, organizing the teas and coffees. Because if all we want to do is to get together and like share some ideas, if in order to do it, you've got to spend 90% of your time doing the logistics, you might say, oh, forget it. So, there are multiple reasons for having one, but they're not entirely necessary. And yeah, they're useful if you're trying to maximize it.
And that's what happened in JP Morgan. They said for a condition for a community of practice to exist is that two people are gonna look after it, because everybody is busy, you know, super busy. If nobody looks after the community, it's just gonna fade away on the other priorities. So that's what they decided, and that's what works for them in that context, you know. But it's not that all communities need a facility. In that context, where there are so many other things pushing, it's good to have two people who take it upon themselves to make sure this community continues to exist. So we're going to take you very briefly through a little cartoon to kind of illustrate what we mean by this process of social learning to make a difference.
And so people come together, and actually this is particularly a community of practice, but so people come together because they want to make a difference. That's their reason for coming together. However that's expressed, not everybody necessarily sits down and agrees on the difference they want to make, but people are in that space with a piece of their heart and their soul wanting to make a difference.
And they recognize it in each other. I think that's important, because they recognize that heart and soul, like Bev was saying, as a okay, you are my partner in this thing. You know, whether the difference you want to make is exactly the same as mine is not the point. The point is, I recognize you as a partner, and I'm ready to appreciate how difficult it is to make the difference you want to make. And therefore, I will appreciate that you have uncertainty. I will not use your uncertainty to look down on you, but I will appreciate your uncertainty as a driver for our learning together.
And with in that coming together and in being with other people where you can really talk honestly about your practice, because honestly about your practice means you can say you're uncertain, but out of those conversations, you get some good ideas about what somebody else is doing. You get tools, you get tips, you get friendships. You get renewed confidence in yourself that what you're doing is right, but you get stuff.
Or on the other hand, you could get a realization that the difference you wanted to make was too ambitious. You need to just become more realistic, you know? So.
And then actually, for a lot of learning, if we're talking about learning theories, for a lot of learning, the assumption is that learning ends there. You've got the ideas, you've got the information, you've got the tools, you've got the tips, and you go off and you apply them. And yeah.
But for us, learning goes on, because getting an idea is just the beginning. Ideas are, you know, easy to come, easy go. What's really hard is, how do you take an idea and you put it in practice? That's a very learningful event. For some people, they think when knowledge is good, it should be applicable easily. But in practice, that's not the way it is. An idea needs to be adapted, transformed, opportunistically applied here and there. It's a very learningful moment to apply an idea in practice.
And a lot of the time, it doesn't quite work. So you've got to adjust it, right? So you're constantly like taking the idea and making little micro changes to it. But you do that by seeing the effect, which may be positive. It may have a good result, or it may not work. But what's most important is that you take this story of how you tried something out, what you did to put it into practice, and whether it worked or not. You take that story back to your community, because it's in that story of how things work in practice or not. And very often when things work or not, it's often down to very fine-grained details. You know, I managed to do it on a Tuesday when I know that my boss, you know, has had a good night's sleep. you know, you don't know, right? So it's the micro things of how you put something to use and what happened as a result, and taking it back to your community who are excited to hear the story because they want to know how to do it too. They'll be interested to know your fine-grained details of the story.
And so we would like to conclude on this notion of a learning loop, that a community of practice is really a learning loop between moments of meeting each other in a social learning space and making sure that the learning of practice comes back into that space. Because sometimes we will run a community of practice as a series of topics. So in September, we'll talk about the first phase of a circular economy, and in October we'll talk about the second phase, and in November the third phase, and so on and so forth. And you hop from topic to topic. Now, hopping from topic to topic for a lecture series is very good, but if you are doing a community of practice, make sure that there are loops, you know, that it's not jumping from one topic to the next, but that you really have this continuity of developing the practice, refining the practice, knowing what works and what doesn't. And that's the difference between a community of practice and a lecture series.
And so you'd expect to see in a community of practice plenty of time in the agenda for talking about how people have used and taken up the ideas, the advice, the stories of other people, and how they used it and how they put it into practice and what happened. So you'd expect to have a lot of that in the agenda. And you'd expect to have also, you know, people talking about how they think they're going to put things into practice. Because it's not enough, you know, there may be 5 people in the room thinking, oh, I could do this with that. And if they articulate what they're going to try out, other people might say, oh, yeah, I never thought of that. So you want people to be thinking and sharing with each other, even how they're going to, how they think they can put something into practice. So it's these stories of what happens in practice, what you hope to do in practice, what happens as a result, what you hope will be the result. That's the treasure chest of a community of practice. That's the resource bank of a community of practice, is these stories about practice and what works and what doesn't.
So we do have a few minutes for questions or discussion or stories of your own. So let's just open the floor now.
Thanks very much, both. We've got a roving mic in the room, so please do engage your uncertainty. We know you're all here to make a difference, and you care to make a difference, particularly those people on the program. So any questions for Etienne and Bev?
Hi. It's not on, but I've got a loud voice. Oh, it is on.
Etienne,
we can hear you.
Can you turn the slide off so we've got more
Oh, yeah.
real estate?
So my question is one of reality, which is how does a community of practice like this exist and make impactful change in a post-Brexit, post-economy, post-COVID, and post-war for Ukraine world? At the end of the day, cake is cake, but it's part of the economy. So how do we actually think we're going to impact change using these processes?
Well, I mean, I think that there is a need for these communities more than ever, because the world is changing so fast that you don't have time to write a book and to create a course, you know, to address real challenges. So uncertainty is the state of the world today, you know, and if we don't learn to deal with uncertainty together, we are lost as a species. I think the species, the survival of the species is at stake, you know, and really the traditional way of doing learning, which is we do research, we write papers, we create a course, and then we instruct practitioners what to do. It's just too slow. Not that it's bad. I think we love researchers, and we are really grateful, that we start to understand what's happening to the climate and everything. We love that, but we also need to move fast to do stuff, and so I think JP Morgan Chase is not facilitating communities of practice out of the goodness of their heart. They are a business enterprise, but they think, oh, this is going to help us achieve our strategic goals, because if we have a group of people around the world discussing cybersecurity candidly, saying what works and what doesn't work, our chance of not having our website hacked is really increased than if they just all practice on their own. So the urgency to create this learning context where practitioners can really discuss real problems together and make progress together, I think is more urgent than ever. So, and actually in COVID, during COVID, what we thought, and it was at JP Morgan very much the case, what we thought is that COVID was going to kill communities. It was the opposite. When COVID hit, people were not in the office anymore. They needed companionship,
And they also needed to know, wow, this is a startlingly new situation. What on earth do we do? University heads who normally never speak to each other, they usually are concerned with their own university and maybe a few cocktail parties, but that's it. Suddenly university heads were reaching out to each other saying, wow, maybe we need a community of practice. How do we deal with universities in the time of COVID? And they reached out to each other. They may have got it wrong. They may have done all sorts of things. It was a learning process for everybody. But but these surprises on the human race, which are going to come thick and fast over the next few years, we're going to need community of practice even more.
I'd agree. Any questions? Question down the front here. And just while the mic is making its way over, this presentation will be uploaded to our website, as will all of the other presentations from today. So you can access what's been said and get in touch with us or any of the groups after today.
And we have a lot more resources available on our website. So maybe you should share that website with people, because there's a lot of free stuff there.
We'll do that, Etienne. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. On one of the slides, it says mutual learning creates value. I think it should add for all, because we want all participants to get something out of it, including some people like a teacher will contribute, but they think they haven't learned anything. And the other bit is about sharing of mistakes. Being a farmer is that I'll go and play Skittles on a Wednesday night, and the first thing I'll say on the Wednesday night is, I made this stupid mistake, I did that in field X, because I know my neighbour's going to look over the hedge and see that. And if I volunteer that first, it's a really good bit of learning. And also, we are not usually in direct competition with our neighbouring farmers. If you're a supermarket, you are not going to share any of your failures with alternative supermarkets, because that's bad for your business. How can we develop wider sharing communities in the wider world, other than away from us farmers who are a bit loons?
That's a really good point. And so, well, first of all, inside of organizations, a bit easier because people trust each other. They can share mistakes, they can share good ideas, and they know their competitors are not going to use them to compete with them. So, that was the first place where communities of practice happened. But now we see, I mean, even in the humanitarian sector, they compete for funding, these people, and so it is good that the community of practice is actually not run by one of those organizations. It's run by the Center for Competence in Humanitarian Negotiation, which is a third actor, if you will, run independently. And the the organization that actually sponsor, because they receive funding from this humanitarian organization, these humanitarian organizations do not have access to those meetings, you know? So those meetings are really practitioner meetings and they are protected. So practitioners can actually share mistakes without that having implications for their managers and things like that. So you need to manage that carefully. Some communities say, "Hey, we're only sharing pre-competitive information. You know, we don't sharing the secret of Coca-Cola. You know, but you know, we can share about what's happening with the sugar." With the sugar field and where are the good sources of sugar or something. I don't know. I'm just inventing off the top of my head here. But yeah, no, definitely that's something to take
I
into
think also
consideration.
there's something about the scale of the problem that can bring even competitors together. Now, I might be completely wrong, but I don't know, when there was mad cow disease, for example, in the UK or in Portugal too, where we are, but, where farmers were having to, kill their whole herds of cattle. Now, I don't know enough about it, but I don't know if farmers actually reached out to each other to help warn each other, because it was going to destroy the whole industry. So, there are, when there is a big enough problem that faces people often will come together, maybe not over the small things, but over the big things.
Thank
And when you
you.
think about something like the circular economy, it's like, maybe everybody benefits from other industrial participants to think about it in terms of a circular economy. I don't know if they compete on that or not. That's up to you as a community of practice to decide what's shareable and what's not, But communities of practice can make rules. We have seen communities of practice make rules about what's shareable and what's not. And when everybody agrees about the rule, then learning can proceed.
Any more questions in the room? Maybe we take one from online and then we'll go to break. So, Jennifer, any online questions?
Jennifer had one about the roles within the COP, Agenda Activist, Social Reporter, Community Keeper. I think it's too short a time to go into what those roles are. But yes, it can be useful. We'd say essential, that it's very important to distribute the leadership roles in a community of practice. And when we talk about leadership, we don't mean leadership from the front. We mean that there are some people thinking very specifically, are we addressing the right issues here, or are we going off track? Are these really relevant to us and our practice? So you can invite somebody or a group of people within the community to pay particular attention to that. There's very important in community of practice that you get to hear everybody's voice, that no voice gets in the way of learning. You don't have an intruder who jumps in. So you could, it could be just the facilitator who does that, but it could be an individual or a group of individuals within the community who pay particular attention to that. It's very important to keep a shared memory, and so on. So there are different things that are very important in a community of practice. And rather than think of all of those tasks being in the hands of one person, who apart from anything else will burn out if they do everything, but by distributing those roles across the community, then members feel more ownership and have more say in shaping what the community looks like.
And I would say that when Bev introduced these groups, these leadership groups, to that community of internal auditors that you saw a picture of, it saved that community. That community was kind of like almost dying, I think, of early death. And when Bev introduced these groups into the community and assigned people to these groups, their sense of what it meant to be